Hello, everybody. It's Explorer Mike, and it's that time where we talk about historical fiction. That's right. It's another time to where we dive deep into the historical facts and books about historical fiction. So let's begin our journey. What is exactly historical fiction? Historical fiction basically resolves in two sources. It has to be author personalizes it and makes the readers feel like they're living during that time frame. So basically, historical fiction gives accuracy in detail, but you want the readers to feel like you're there. So, historical fiction is a time when authors get to actually provide a ton of detail on what's happening and really make you feel like you're there. I mean, so as we explore this journey and we go down, we're going to delve into more about the historical fiction and exactly what it means. Information, authors, facts, and imagination. Historical fiction has to be based off of facts. It also has to include a little bit of imagination. It's called historical for the reason being that it is pertaining to history and facts that happened, not talking about the Eiffel Tower being in New York City, or not talking about George Washington conquering Canada. That would not be considered historical fiction. Okay. So, exactly historical fiction, information about the past and what it was like to live in that time. Now, that doesn't mean you have to give a time and it doesn't mean you have to give an exact place. But what you do have to do is make sure you're getting good information and accurate information on what it was like to be there at the time of the story or the book. Example, Little House on the Prairie. Naturally, we believe that to be set up in the 1800s, naturally, Midwest, rural area, country life, and then all of a sudden, you don't have a car in it. Okay, there's no trucks that came by. All right, so you really want to try to write about what it would be like in that time frame. So that gives you the first major part of historical fiction. Okay, next is the popularity of historical fiction. Of course, everybody has sat there, everybody's been in class, and everybody's like, oh, I hate history. Oh my goodness, this history class. It's just boring to me. It's something that happened a long time ago. So it's not really that popular today, but there are more historical fiction books out there than any other. Why? Because it's true. We have recordings of it, and it's easier to write about because we have a time, date, place, and accuracy of what happened. Okay, so I personally love historical fiction. Unlike people that love poetry, could not handle doing that, that's for sure. That's why we're going to continue our exploration and we're going to go on why, on the popularity portion of it. You know, it's hard because when generations nowadays or people nowadays, it's hard to picture yourself 1, 2, 3 generations ago when these stories are happening. Okay, so basically, me sitting here right now in 2021, it's hard for me to comprehend being in 1942 in Hitler's regime. We weren't there. It's hard to imagine us putting ourselves there. We weren't living at that time in that place to actually know what was going on. That's why a good historical fiction writer is going to be able to put you in that time and that place and keep your attention. Okay. Just like today, 2021, 100 years from now, people are going to look at this and go, man, I couldn't believe they weren't flying in the air. or I can't believe that they didn't have holographic images that did everything for you. I mean, so it's very hard on popularity just due to the fact that it's just so hard to put yourself in that present time of what it was actually like. Things that we see on TV or that we read about or something of that. I mean, it still doesn't. It gives you a very minor scope of what it's like, not exactly what's happening all around during that time period. Okay. Um, a lot of people nowadays, instead of historical fiction, they do select realistic fiction, unlike historical fiction. But like I said, there are so much more historical out there than there is realistic fiction. Okay. So we're going to continue on, but what I want to do is check your knowledge and see if you can answer this question. All right, let's get back to our exploration. We're about a quarter of the way there right now. Let's talk about what is historical fiction. Okay, what makes it be historical fiction? I mean, to me, it just sounds mighty. I mean, it's like it's history, it's manly, it's beefy. What is it about? What's historical fiction? Tell me. Is it? It's not about Tinkerbell or fairies running around, unicorns or mythic beast or something of that nature. It's just real good sweat, women and children, men, providing for us so that we are here today. I mean, that's how it feels like to me. Kind of feel like Patton right there, blah, 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 but so in order for historical fiction to be believable, there's value in it, okay? And those value that you can instill upon people, for example, would be um, the conflicts that were taking place then. We're talking things like in the Civil War, the Revolutionary War, Spanish American War, the Dust Bowl, the Wall Street collapsing in 1930. We can talk about World War One, World War Two. So you learn the conflicts that actually happened in life, that our ancestors and your greats and greats and greats and greats were involved in and survived and made it through. You also learn about the suffering that had happened. Talk about Black Lives Matter right now. Imagine the movement in the 60s. Imagine the movement against the Vietnam War. Imagine being called up to serve for your country in 1920 in the war at 17, 18 years old, knowing that 500,000 died and didn't come home. I mean, it's just tragic to know that these events were real. Okay. You also can enjoy or have joy. You can talk about um, women being liberated and being able to vote in the 20s. You can talk about winning and stopping slavery in the war of the Civil War. You can talk about us getting our independence. I mean, you can talk about overcoming and beating the Nazi regime. I mean, there's so much great things that could happen um, during historical times and historical fiction. We can also get despair. Some of those things that we had already covered on. Kind of goes with conflict and suffering on that. I mean, what could have happened? What could things done differently? Great learning experience from that. Changing of the times. I mean, here's a big one on historical fiction. Um, when you go into changing of the times, um, let's just kind of put it like it's easy for us to understand things that have happened in the past and now we've moved on from and learned from it. So it's kind of like when your mom always used to tell you, don't touch a stove and you touch it and you burn yourself and you move on, you learn not to do that again. Well, that's the same thing that historical fiction tells us. Basically, whenever, riots happen, marches happen, joy happens, whenever there's conflict and unfortunately bad things happen, that's when people learn the most is not to do that again. or that didn't work the first time, or we need to learn from that mistake so that we don't do that again. All right. Historical fiction can teach us, that we are changing and evolving. I mean, look at things that happened 100 years ago, 50 years ago, 20 years ago, compared to what we have right now. 20 years ago, there was no iPhone, and that's only in 20 years. So imagine the changes in technology that historical fiction can chronically put together for you so that you can see how much is actually happening. Look at flying and cars and kitchen appliances and phones and laptops and computers, especially. I mean, technology is 20, 25 years old. So just look at those changes, and that can tell you something that you can help teach your kids on what is it going to be like 25 years from now? What are we going to have? Holy cow, it's going to be amazing. All right. So, what we're going to do now is it's that time again. We are going to see what you know. All right, I hope you got that one right. Now we're going to talk about types of historical fiction. Okay, we're going to get into some of the meat and cheese of what actually is historical fiction. Go back one. Sorry, we need to go back. My bad. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to talk about types. All realistic stories that are set in the past. Now, realistic stories that are set in the past. Okay. So, basically, what we want to talk about is um, it can start off with events, it can start off with people. Okay. For examples, a realistic story could be talked about Washington crossing the Delaware, not Washington crossing the Ohio River. Okay. Not um, Martin Luther King becoming the president of China. Okay. So, historical fiction, the different types that you want to start with, it all has to be realistic, and it has to be realistic stories, and it has to be stories that are set in the past. So, the largest, it would be stories around actual events of people. So, for example, like we had talked about, George Washington crossing the Delaware. This could be in historical fiction. Okay. It can also be talked about because we have it recorded, documentations of it. We know the facts of it. Okay. JFK. I mean, we can talk about him and his accomplishments, what he did. There's records or historical facts all the way up to his death. We could talk about Reagan bringing down the Berlin Wall. Anything that is true and accurate or set to be true and accurate through documentation brings out historical fiction, brings out the writing of historical fiction. Okay. Um, Historical fiction is brought when truth meets reality. Okay. So, live characters, live people, live places, live events. All right. So, stories around actual events and actual people. Okay. All right. For another example, would be little or known reference to actual events or actual people. Okay. So, what this is talking about basically is when let's say, for example, you're talking as the book does in Paul Revere. Okay. You're not talking about Paul Revere. You're not talking about Paul Revere and what he's doing. You can be bringing it from the apprentice of Paul Revere, who is talking about him and talking about what's going on. Or my example that I thought of, honestly, is what if I was on a colonial battlefield and I've gotten a perspective and I want to talk about the great George Washington and what type of man he actually was, what type of person he was, what he did actually. How was he on a, I mean, we hear all the truth and greatness of it. So, I mean, you're talking about him. So it doesn't have to be in reference to that person. It could be in reference to him from another viewpoint of somebody else. Okay. Doesn't have to be an exactual one event. You could be talking about, um, Abraham Lincoln growing up in St. Louis, that doesn't give, an event of when John Wilkes Booth killed him. Okay. So you can have little or no reference to an actual event or an actual person, but you can bring it from the eyes of somebody who witnessed or saw it, can be considered historical fiction also. The largest one that I like, and I'm going to bring you a great example that everybody's going to know, is historical fiction brought out theatrical scripts. And what a theatrical script is, here is a great example: the Broadway play Hamilton. Okay, theatrical scripts are brought together on something that had happened historically or to an historical person or somebody that is historical, and it's brought forth by numerous different people all telling the same account and telling something that happened. So prime example would be Hamilton. Love it, love watching it, watched it the day it came out on television, rented it, whatever you want to call it, Disney Plus it, but it talks about what Hamilton and Burr did and the events that occurred, but it's also talking about during that play numerous people's aspects or numerous people giving their point of view of what it actually is. From the singing and everything aside, I mean, it still gave it from the aspect of Burr, aspect of Hamilton, the lawyers that were involved, the president, the commander, everything that was happening or going on. Those are theatrical scripts. So numerous people talking about numerous things about one in particular historical deal. All right. That's by far my favorite because you get a lot of information, a lot of things going on with a lot of people talking about what's happening. And it makes it kind of funny. You don't lose yourself in the reading mind of it, basically from just a one point of view. So to me, that's my favorite. All right, you know what time it is. Let's see if we can guess the right answer. Okay, now let's talk about evaluating historical fiction. Okay, evaluation of historical fiction. Um, what makes it? How can you say that it actually is? All right. Um, Basically, there's uh, not a lot of really, talking about uh, just that one, it needs to tell a good, interesting story in its own right. Okay. Not multiple versions or multiple stories that are happening all at the same time. You're focusing on an individual story, individual thing that's happening, event that's happening that is accurate. Okay. Um, there needs to be a good balance of fact and fiction. All right. You don't want to be overwhelmed with a ton of facts because that's going to make something boring. When all you're doing is sitting there and you're fact checking everything and you're sitting there going, well, this happened, this happened, this happened, and this happened in 1926, and this happened in 1927. Then you can start to get in, a little bored with what's going on because there's just so much factual information and not enough storytelling. So you want to have a good balance of fact, a good balance of fiction or storytelling that's going on, so that you can keep your interest in it. All right. The biggest thing on evaluating historical fiction is that mostly facts and details will be presented, though. Okay. So you're not going to be, you're not going to be questioned on could this really be right, or I don't see any record of that happening. So You want to make sure that facts and details are correct for time periods. Like we talked about earlier, Little House on the Prairie didn't have farm trucks. Okay. So also in evaluating, these are big keys right here, fiction, whether it to be good or not or true, is one, the culture. Okay, so when you're writing your story and you're going through it, you want to make sure that the culture is matching what you want the readers to believe the time period is. Okay, the language needs to be the same as the time period. You're not going to have somebody from the turn of the 1900s sitting there talking slang from the 2020s. Okay, they're not going to be listening to Elvis, in the 1930s. So you want to make sure language is correct, the emotions, thoughts, and concerns are correct. People from 1870 are not really concerned about gas prices. Okay, their thought is not going to be what I'm going to do this weekend. I'm sure it's on growing food, tending to the family. Okay, you want to make sure also the experiences that the character has are for that time frame. So, in essence, if somebody's walking down a dirt road, they're not going to come up upon, and it's in the late 1890s, they're not going to come up on a house fully with electricity. Okay, or they're not going to go and battle with a dragon. They're not going to be on a battlefield and sit there and fight unicorns. There's not going to be a mythic beast that just pops out of nowhere. There's not going to be elves. So you want to make sure that the experience are accurate and correct. All right. Background information is the key. Whenever you're writing historical fiction, you want to make sure, you don't have to give a time frame, but you want to make sure that the background information that you're telling the readers is accurate for the time frame. You want them to understand where it is in time, what is going on. So the more background information, the better odds it is of getting evaluated correctly as being historical fiction. So the more details you can produce, the better it's going to be. All right, and the better it keeps and holds the people's engagement with it. Okay, classroom approaches on it. This is to help you teach in the classroom. Make sure that you don't set this off to the side by itself because history can be boring to most people. So you want to pull a common topic. If you're sitting there going over language arts and you're reading a book to the class and the class is reading along with you, and you're talking about, Elvis Presley's life or something, musically related or something, tie in your language arts with history that happened at that time. Also, by the way, during Elvis's time, we were going through the Vietnam War at the late end of his life, or at the time, John F. Kennedy was coming up. Guess what? We were working on the space program, so it's tying those things together in other subjects that can make it more enjoyable for your classroom. The biggest thing, too, is read books about historical fiction that are chronologically in order. You don't want to start with, Maze Runner 4 and then turn around and try to go back. I say Maze Runner, but it's not correct. But, you don't want to turn around and try to go back to number 1, number 2, and then number 3. I know the movies may depict or bring out things in different sequential order, like Star Wars, but you want to try to read them in order of what's happening so that they can follow along and not get frustrated with losing time. Okay. Relate to your social studies that are going on. Make sure that whatever you're doing in social studies, that you can also turn around and talk about historical fiction or events that were also going on at the same time frame. You're just tying it together. Challenging perspectives. Connect again with recent activities. If war and terrorism is going on, tie it to 9/11 and what was happening. You want to integrate with other subjects that we talked about in the classroom. Try and tie those things together, and that's the most challenging part is figuring out, okay, if I'm doing math or I'm doing English, how am I going to tie this in so that they understand history a little bit better? They understand the things that happen. Because like I said, it's a little bit of a harder journey for some to get into history. Okay. And then to wrap things up, You know, what I decided to do was turn around and pick out some of the best, most top selling historical fictions that are out there. So here's just some examples of some of the great works of historical fiction that is number ones right out there for people to read. And maybe it'll be something that you read also and that you also enjoy. So basically, we're going to end with one more question to make sure that brain of yours used its sonar to understand what we were talking about. I hope you enjoyed everything that we're doing, and I'll talk to you guys later.